Saruman is one of the most iconic villains in fantasy literature and cinema, as for a majority of the Lord of the Rings saga, he is the most present evil in the path of the Fellowship. Not only this, but his portrayal in Peter Jackson's adaptation is phenomenal, as Christopher Lee really just can't be beat. But that being said, Saruman has some major plot points that were changed or simply removed for the film adaptation, one of which is a mysterious encounter that our three hunters have at the edge of Fangorn Forest. That's right, in the books, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli actually camp for a night before pursuing Merry and Pippin's tracks into Fangorn, and during their time of rest, they see none other than Saruman disguised as an old man coming upon their fire. Today, we're going to uncover the details of this mysterious visit, as well as other crucial details that get left out of these scenes in the movie, like Éomer's true conversation with Aragorn and Merry and Pippin's actual fate the night before. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 23 of Movies vs. Manuscripts Lord of the Rings edition. This is the show where I analyze your favorite fantasy books and movies and compare the originals to the adaptations to spot every single difference scene by scene. Today, we are covering our three hunters' encounter with the Riders of Rohan and their discovery of Merry and Pippin's fate at the edge of Fangorn. What is just a couple of short scenes in the movie actually spans a couple chapters in the book, as Éomer has extended discussions with Aragorn and the other hunters, and the search for Merry and Pippin's tracks take more than a day, unlike the couple of minutes it takes for Aragorn in the movie. Before diving into these things though, I wanted to shout out this commenter from a previous episode. Each week I'll be highlighting one of my favorite comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts down below when you're done watching. Also, YouTube told me that 95% of you aren't even subscribed, which frankly is quite criminal. So hit that subscribe button and come back every Saturday for new episodes in this series. Per usual, I'll be analyzing the differences across the four major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's recap what happens in these scenes of the movie so it's fresh on our mind when going over the changes. Picking up from where we left off last week, we see our three hunters traversing the plains of Rohan, and Legolas remarks that blood has been spilled as the red sun rises. Suddenly, they realize that an entire host of horsemen are riding in their direction, and so they quickly hide behind a rock. After the riders cross and Aragorn realizes that the Riders of Rohan, he calls out for them and they turn around to surround the three hunters. After being surrounded, we meet Éomer. They exchange some words, but ultimately after a few witty remarks and revealing their names, Éomer says that he and his men have been banished as Theoden no longer recognizes their loyalty. He then decides to lend them a couple horses to help with their search for Merry and Pippin, as Éomer believes that their friends were slaughtered the night before. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli then ride off towards the edge of Fangorn, where a pile of orc bodies are now burning. They have a brief moment of grief as Aragorn kicks a helmet. Did you know? But shortly after crying out, Aragorn picks up the hobbits' trail and tracks them into the forest, realizing that they must be alive as they escaped during the commotion of the fight. And that is where our scenes end for this week. There's quite a few changes we need to cover this week, so let's jump right into our first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. These categories are really quite simple as there aren't timeline or location differences for these scenes, at least that I picked up on. So if you noticed anything related to these categories that I missed, let me know in the comments. As for characters, we have two more interesting deviations, which is the omission of Saruman and Maur. Of course, you know who Saruman is, but Maur is an Uruk-hai general who is leading a separate pack of Uruks from Isengard, and he plays a critical role later on during Merry and Pippin's escape. But in order to get to that, we first need to cover Éomer's involvement in these scenes. So let's jump into our plot changes. As always, if you're wanting to relive Tolkien's Middle-earth in a whole new way and have yet to join Audible, you can check out my link in the description to get a free trial, which includes one free audiobook. Follow along with me each week as I do this series and support the channel at the same time. Okay, so as I've mentioned, today we are covering two scenes, so this video kind of gets broken up into two different halves. These two scenes relate to two different chapters and they're kind of out of order. We're going to analyze them in the order of Jackson's adaptation, so that means we're starting off with our three hunters encountering Éomer and the Riders of Rohan. Afterwards, we'll look at all the differences between the book and the movie in regard to Merry and Pippin's fate, and Aragorn tracking them into Fangorn. As for Éomer's role in the scene, we have a lot to cover. You see, Tolkien writes about 30 minutes of back and forth dialogue in this chapter, as Éomer talks with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. What we get in the movie is really just the very much so abbreviated highlights, as it would be impossible to literally show the entirety of the dialogue. In similar fashion, I cannot go through every line spoken in this video, but the conversation is important and quite different, so I am going to quickly list out the order of their conversation and the main bullet points which were touched upon. Before we do that, however, there are 3 minor changes that relate to this conversation and the Riders of Rohan. And hey, it's my job to list off everything I notice. So first, starting with our 3 hunters running along the plain in the scene, Legolas never confirms that blood has been spilled like he does in the movie. It's actually quite an odd change, as in the book he does reference a red dawn, but very specifically says that he does not know if it means for good or evil. So Jackson's twisting of this line is quite opposite from the book. Next, in the movie, Aragorn seems to hear or feel the vibration of the ground as the Riders of Rohan are coming their way. But in the book, they see a shadow way off in the distance, moving quickly on the ground about 5 leagues away. Legolas, with his keen elf eyes, spots that there are 105 and that their leader is tall and fair. He also says that he sees no hobbits with them, but there are 3 empty saddles. They then decide to wait there on the ground for the riders to overtake them, as they are weary and they know they can't outrun the horses. This plays into the next small change, which is that they don't hide behind a rock, but actually just sit down in the middle of the plain, as their Lothlorien cloaks are enough disguise for them. We'll talk about this more during Éomer's conversation with them as well, so keep that in mind. Real quick before we head into that conversation, I did just want to make note of this part of the scene in the movie, as even when I was a kid, I remember this feeling odd to me. Aragorn and the others seem to be on a small hill in a field, and suddenly Aragorn bends down to the ground, then he urges them to go behind a rock, and literally seconds after, the Riders of Rohan pass. Now, I am no expert, but if the Riders of Rohan were close enough to pass literally seconds after our trio found cover, couldn't they have easily just looked to their left and seen a massive group of over 100 horses running towards them? Additionally, shouldn't Éomer have seen them sprinting to cover? I get that Lothlorien cloaks are good, but they're not that good. In all situations in the book of them being nearly invisible, it's when they are sitting still or in the dark, not while they're running in broad daylight. Anyway, that's not so much a change, but just a pet peeve of mine. Now let's move on to Éomer's conversation with them, and like I said, I can't cover every line, but let's go through point by point, hitting the main topics. First, Aragorn introduces himself as Strider, not Aragorn. Éomer is thrown off by this, as he says that Strider isn't a name for a man. Second, after asking for the names of the other 2 silent companions, Gimli says his line from the movie, but before Éomer threatens to cut his head off, Gimli actually insults him first. You see, Aragorn had told Éomer that they passed through Lothlorien. This is because Éomer was curious how the 3 hunters hid from the riders as they rode by, as Aragorn and his companions were sitting in plain sight. Aragorn explained that it's because of their Lothlorien cloaks. Éomer is shocked that they made it through Lothlorien, as their tales in Rohan speak ill of those woods and the lady in those lands. I think you can see where this is going, but in the book, after Gimli introduces himself, he insults Éomer, saying that he should not speak ill of that which is fair, but brushes it off, saying that Éomer is excused because of his little wit. This is what prompts Éomer to say the line about cutting off Gimli's head. In the movie, it's a little more abrupt as Gimli doesn't provoke him, but in the book, it's pretty well deserved as Gimli has essentially just called Éomer an idiot in front of all of his men. Third, we do then get Legolas setting his bow and telling Éomer that he would be shot before a stroke fell, but the following conversation is what is cut from the film. Aragorn says that his companion's quick temper will make sense once Éomer understands their journey, and asks for him to give them a chance to share their tale. Aragorn then asks Éomer who he serves, and we learn that Éomer serves the king of Rohan, but that the lands are not fully against Mordor either, as no allegiance has been made in either direction. Éomer then asks who Aragorn is, and then we have one of the largest changes in regard to the movie dialogue, as Aragorn draws his sword Andúril and proclaims his lineage and name, which immediately causes Éomer to be shocked and amazed. In the movie, Aragorn doesn't have his sword yet, and he also isn't too keen on sharing his heritage and full name with people. But in the book, he is proud and aware of his destiny to be king. Plus, in this dire moment of searching for Merry and Pippin, I think he is ready to pull out all the stops. Fourth, now that Éomer is in Aragorn's service, as he fully knows that he is a friend and a man of lordship, Aragorn requests aid and news of the orc pack that they've been hunting. Similarly, they explain that there were 2 hobbits in the group, and the men of Rohan nearly laugh at this, as hobbits are only in their tales and they don't believe that they exist. But Éomer confirms with them that they left none alive and burnt the bodies. One of Éomer's men says that they must continue on as they are losing time, and tells Éomer that they should leave the strangers or bind them and take them to the king. Éomer then tells his men to assemble and prepare to leave while he privately speaks to the 3 companions. He tells Aragorn that he knows he isn't telling him the full truth and asks for their full tale. Aragorn then recounts their mission and journey since Rivendell, naming off Boromir, of whom the men of Rohan know, as well as Gandalf. At this, Éomer fills Aragorn in on some missing context, which shares that Gandalf brings ill tidings often to Rohan, and therefore is not very well liked, especially by the king. Last time Gandalf was in Rohan, he had delivered news that Saruman was now an enemy, and that he had been imprisoned at Orthanc, but Theoden did not heed these tidings and sent Gandalf off, and since Gandalf took Shadowfax, the king's best horse, it angered Theoden even more. Aragorn then reported to Éomer the fall of Gandalf and the death of Boromir, which caused great distress for Éomer. The fifth point in this conversation is that they speak more about their journey, and Éomer is greatly impressed by their sprint across the plains, as they have traveled more than 40 leagues in just a few days on foot. Éomer then dubs Aragorn Wingfoot, as he says Strider is too poor a name for such great a journey. Then he gives information of his own to Aragorn, sharing what happened with the orc pack they hunted and killed, and also informing the companions that Rohan has never paid tribute to Sauron. Éomer then invites Aragorn and the others to come back to Rohan, but Aragorn says that although his heart desires to go with him, he cannot, as they still want to find out the fate of their friends. And lastly, at number 6, Éomer says that it is against their law for him to let strangers go free in their land, but also says that it would be unfair for him to fight them 100-3. Aragorn then tells him that his laws were not made for such times, and that he must make a decision, but if he does decide to fight, less than 100 horsemen will return to Edoras. Just as in the movie, Éomer decides to lend them help and gives them 2 horses. The difference is that in the book, this is directly against their law, and Tolkien writes that many of his men disagreed with this decision, and looked on in doubt and wonder. Éomer tells Aragorn that he lends them these horses in hope that once their errand will end, they will return to the house of Meduseld, where Theoden sits, and return the horses and give answer for Éomer's actions. He tells them that his life is now in their hands, and the 3 companions are very grateful for this decision, promising to return to Edoras once they have completed their quest. Now that wraps up Éomer's involvement this week, and for those of you who are very well versed in the book or are reading along with me, you might have spotted some key moments that I left out, so feel free to comment anything that I missed below. Otherwise, check it out in the books for the full account. Okay, now let's move on to the second half of this week's scenes and discuss Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli's close call with Saruman spying on them. First, a quick change is that Legolas actually removes the saddle from his horse, as elves do not need them. In the movies, they keep the saddle on. Next, the movie portrays them arriving at the remains of the Uruk-hai encampment and quickly discovering that Merry and Pippin are quote-unquote dead. But in the books, they don't give up so quickly, as it says that they searched for clues or trails of the hobbits until nightfall. It is then at that point that Gimli gives up, saying that surely the hobbits' remains are amongst the burning orcs. But Aragorn and Legolas remind him that Gandalf intended for Merry and Pippin to come despite Elrond's disagreement. Gimli then says that Gandalf also came and he was the first to fall, so his foresight must have failed him. But book Aragorn, being much more wise than movie Aragorn, rightly points out that foresight doesn't mean you won't die, it just means that you make the right decision despite the outcome. After searching for some clues, we have our next change, as in the movie, they solve the riddle of Merry and Pippin's escape essentially right after they get to the encampment, but in the book, they sleep for the night on the edge of Fangorn, and it is during this night camping that we have another large moment that was changed for the movie, which is the omission of Saruman's appearance. This is such a crazy moment for the book, and I love that it was included, as it adds some mystery to this moment, but the movie completely removes this and makes things pretty cut and dry. Here's what really happens in the book. While camping, Gimli says that he wants to make a fire, but Aragorn warns against it as he does not want to anger the trees, as their path is likely to lead inside of Fangorn. He also says that they are close to the traitor Saruman's lands, and lighting a fire would put a little too large of a beacon on them for Aragorn's liking. Despite Aragorn's warning, Gimli is excited to see that there is leftover kindling from the Rohirrim's fire, and therefore Gimli does not need to cut any more wood. He runs off and gathers the kindling, and then starts a fire for their camp. They sit around and discuss why Celeborn warned them against traveling into Fangorn, which by the way is a book special, so check out the episodes on Lothlorien for more info on that. Legolas then asks Aragorn what peril lives in the woods, and Aragorn says that he might have asked Legolas that, because he isn't sure himself. But they do know one thing, which is that Fangorn is the oldest forest in Middle-earth, alive back during the days of the firstborn of the world. After this brief conversation, they select Gimli for the first watch, and Aragorn and Legolas go to sleep. And this is when we have our mysterious encounter with Saruman. As Gimli kept watch, he suddenly jolted up as a figure of a bent old man in a great cloak and with a pointy hat suddenly appeared in the periphery of the firelight. Too stunned to say anything, Gimli just stared and immediately thought of Saruman in these lands. His movement awoke Aragorn and Legolas, and Aragorn asked the old man what he wanted and invited him to come near the fire for warmth. but as Aragorn walked towards the old figure, he disappeared without a trace. Suddenly, Legolas cried out as the horses were missing, and sure enough, the horses were no longer near, seemingly having run off in the night. After this ill turn of events, the companions tried to rest some more, taking turns in the night to be on watch. Before we move on to the other changes, I just wanted to break this down a little bit. There is quite some debate of if this old figure in Tolkien's writing is Gandalf or Saruman. At this point, the trio doesn't know that Gandalf has been reincarnated, sort of, as Gandalf the White. And a lot of people think that this is Gandalf spying on them before he meets them later inside of Fangorn. Christopher Tolkien, JRR Tolkien's son, actually believes that this was meant to be Gandalf, but by the final draft of the book was actually supposed to be Saruman. What I'm not really sure of is if this is Saruman himself in the flesh, or a vision of Saruman using some of his magic to do some recon. His abilities in the sense aren't fully fleshed out, and so I don't think we'll ever know, as Tolkien never directly specified any of this later in his writings. And when they do meet Gandalf, Gandalf says that he was not the old man that spied on them. But then again, Gandalf the White said a lot of strange things when he meets them. So I'd love to hear from you below if you think this was Saruman or Gandalf. Personally, I do think this was Saruman in the flesh. After all, Éomer does tell them in his conversation, as well as in the movie, that Saruman has been known to travel the lands as an old man, spying and gathering information on the lands of Rohan. Anyway, now we have our final part of this last scene, as we come to Merry and Pippin's true escape. This is a combination of multiple chapters, as in the film, we get a scene which cuts back and forth between Merry and Pippin's escape and Aragorn's tracking at the encampment. So I'll do my best to give an account of Tolkien's version of this event in the best order possible. So here's what really happens in the book. First, let's pick up with Merry and Pippin, as we left off with Grishnak being killed by the riders of Rohan after he had pulled Merry and Pippin away from the main campsite. Merry and Pippin, bound up, now sat still in the night, afraid of being killed by the men of Rohan. But after they felt the coast was clear, they did what you might expect Merry and Pippin to do, and ate lembas that was in their pockets to recover their strength. As they were doing this, we finally meet our last missing character, Maur the Uruk-hai captain, who is leading reinforcements through Fangorn to join Ugluk and attack the riders by surprise. So, as Merry and Pippin sat in the grass enjoying some lembas, they watched as a full-on battle broke out at the Uruk-hai encampment in the distance. Now, it's time for their official escape, but Merry is curious as to how they will do this as their hands and legs are bound. Thankfully, Pippin's hands are only bound for show, as he had previously cut them off and put on a fake binding earlier in the chapter. After removing his rope, he was able to use Grishnak's blade to cut the rest of the ropes and free themselves. After this, they crawled for a bit, and then they got the feeling back in their legs and got up and ran off towards the forest, talking with one another about the journey so far, as Merry had been passed out for most of it. One notable moment is when Merry tells Pippin that if he gets the chance, a whole chapter will be dedicated to Pippin in old Bilbo's book, as Pippin is the true hero of this part of the story. Of course, as we readers know, the book does in fact dedicate this whole chapter to Pippin's point of view. Once they reach Fangorn, they turn around and watch the battle for a while longer, but after a bit they retreat into the woods as they see the Uruk-hai beginning to run toward the forest, trying to escape. We then learn at the end of the chapter that Éomer battled Ugluk 1 versus 1 and killed him, as well as the rest of the orcs, leaving none alive. But at this point, Merry and Pippin were long gone into Fangorn. So now, as for Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli's point of view of these events, it follows a similar path as the movie, but with these updated circumstances under which the hobbits escaped. After waking up the next morning, Gimli continues to say that he thinks the old man from the night before was Saruman, and that he took their horses. However, Legolas shares that he could hear the neighing of horses the night before, and they didn't sound as if they were distressed, but rather happy and joyful. After this brief exchange, Aragorn decides to pick back up on the trail and continue searching for clues, as he now has the light of day back. He tells the others that they must search for clues starting from their own campsite and working their way towards Fangorn, because if the hobbits have escaped, they must have gone into the woods. Sure enough, as they slowly search toward the forest, Aragorn finds a malorn leaf and some crumbs from Merry and Pippin's mid-battle snack, and then he soon after finds cut rope, which were their bindings. This is a really funny part of the chapter, as Legolas is confused by this riddle. How did they cut their ropes if their legs and hands were bound? And after they cut their rope, why did they just sit there and eat lembas while a battle raged on? Then Legolas happily notes that at least they know it was a hobbit, as that is the only answer to the question of the lembas. Aragorn agrees and adds on to this assumption by describing how he thinks things went down, saying that he believes an orc tried to escape with them so he could solely claim the prize. Another important note at this point is that our three companions only have clues that one hobbit escaped, Although they want to believe that both did, they cannot say for certain. Finally, after following the trail toward Fangorn, Aragorn spotted tracks under a tree on the edge of the wood and then confirmed that they turned and ran into the forest. Now our three companions know for sure in which direction they must go. To wrap things up, here's a brief summary of the changes based on Tolkien's version. First, Aragorn sadly doesn't kick a helmet and scream. Second, they don't know that both hobbits escaped. Third, Merry and Pippin ate lembas during the battle to regain strength. And fourth, Grishnak is definitely dead, but we'll get to that in a future episode when the hobbits meet Treebeard. And that wraps things up for this week. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think about these changes? Do you think we should have seen Saruman spying on them at the edge of Fangorn? Would you have preferred a longer dialogue between Éomer and the three hunters? Let me know in the comments below. As always, be sure to like and subscribe and check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.